Okay, so good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining our event. Once again, I'm Callista Chong, the chairperson of the Broad Street Humanities Review, the BSHR in short, and today I'm very pleased to be joined by our guest speakers, Dr. Andrew Homm and Dr. Christopher McIntosh. I'll briefly introduce the BSHR for those who have joined us for the first time. In 2019, the Broad Street Humanities Review is the University of Oxford's very first student-run undergraduate humanities journal, which aims to invigorate interdisciplinary academic writing in our student community and beyond. This term, we are thrilled to introduce a variety of panels that center on the theme time through different disciplinary lenses. In addition to hosting interesting discussions, we produce termly journal issues with the support of a talented team of writers and editors. I will now put some links in the chat that lead to our social media platforms and an upcoming event that we have next week. So feel free to check them out for regular updates and for opportunities to get involved with our publication. Now, perhaps Dr. McIntosh, would you perhaps like to introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure, I'd be delighted. Thank you, Callista. Thank you, Broad Street, for putting this all together. And thanks all of y'all for taking time out of your day for this. My name is Chris McIntosh. I'm an assistant professor at Bard College. I work primarily on questions of temporality, timing, and war. I look at questions regarding the way temporality informs the way we theorize international politics, the way we think about and conceptualize war, the way we treat it substantively, which is what I'll be talking about today. And I also do some work in some other areas involving other forms of political violence, extremist violence, as well as quantum social science, which if y'all are interested in, we can talk about, but I won't hold out much hope.
Great, thank you, Chris. Andy, would like to introduce yourself?
Thanks very much, Callista, and thanks everyone for coming. My name is Andy Homm. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Edinburgh in the School of Social and Political Science. Chris and I often joke that we practically share a brain, so if I had to describe my own research, it would be almost the same. I'm interested in questions of time and history and timing, and I suppose just to differentiate a bit, I might incline a bit more towards international relations theory than war, although that's a really blurry, constantly changing boundary. But I'm very excited to be here and to talk about timeless theories and whether IR theory ever was or ever could be timeless.
Thank you very much, Andy, and thank you, Chris, as well. We are very glad to have the both of you here today. So now we'll speak a bit about the format of the event before we start the presentations proper. So Dr. McIntosh will first present his remarks on timeless theory and war, and Dr. Homm will follow with his presentation, examining whether we should conceive of international relations as timeless or timeful. Following which, we will move into a moderated Q&A segment with the audience. So you're very welcome to submit your questions for both speakers in the chat, which I'll read aloud on your behalf. Alternatively, you may also choose to unmute yourself and turn your camera on if you'd like to ask the question yourself. But please be reminded that this session will be recorded. So if you're not comfortable with that, please just type your question in the chat. Now that all the logistical details have been accounted for, Dr. McIntosh, you have the floor.
Excellent. Thank you so much. As Callista said, I'm going to be talking today about timeless theory and war, and in particular offer what I hope is a conceptual framework an argument for a conceptual framework centered on the present as a way of theorizing our conceptions and ideas about war. So within contemporary political discourse, wars play a significant role in defining our shared past, and oftentimes they preoccupy our thinking about the future. They're crucial markers by which we define political times, right? The interwar period, the post-Cold War era, the antebellum South. But I argue that a full appreciation of war's representation and its function in contemporary world politics requires attending to its temporal dimension and attending to one simple fact, which is that wars occur in the present. The present, though, is rather than simply the vulgar moment of now, I argue, the present cannot be better understood as a socially constructed frame whose boundaries are discursively produced and reproduced. Foregrounding this temporal dimension, I think, reformulates our understanding of the concept of war and articulates it where the present is what the sociologist Mead referred to as the locus of its reality. And I think it would also set it up as allow us to think of it as a social formation that's constituted by heterotemporal experience, which is a concept that I borrow from, that many people have talked about, but I borrow from Hutchings' work, and in particular her book, Time and World Politics. Part of the insight is that war comes only, I argue, war only comes into being via collective imaginaries. Its material characteristics are very real, but its ontological status as a war, I think, requires narratives to produce it as intelligibly something distinct from other forms of political violence, other forms of structural violence, ecological violence, etc. So I want to advance two claims. One is I want to articulate and defend the importance of the present in the study of war and argue how it allows us to better appreciate what Homm says, how the geopolitics of war materialize, quote unquote. And I think it also enables us to grasp the heterotemporality of the practice and experience of war, which I'll talk more about in a second. I also want to hopefully advance the claim, secondly, that the present of war is defined largely by its temporality, and that temporality is socially and politically articulated, and it's something that's central to the functioning of war. That war is not just about guns and tanks and bullets, but it's very much about the way we conceive of it and the way we think about it, and it has implications that go well beyond the war itself. So how the distinctions between war and other manifestations of violence are constructed, the way that they're articulated by powerful political actors, in particular political presence, I argue, shapes the conception, prosecution, and the theorization of war. And so this is a substantive as well as a theoretical claim that I'm trying to advance here. And I think by paying attention to what Thornton calls the quote unquote peculiar temporality of violence, and it's the way in which we often try and reconstruct violence after it happens, yields significant dividends for understanding the ontology of war. It exposes the temporal constitution of war's violence, its emergent and changing character, and the importance of events and experience when we study it. And one example you can think of is the attacks on January 6th that took place within the United States, the way that we all watched it unfold, had to sort of come to grips with it as an event, decide what it was. And now if you follow American politics, the debate has continued as to what it is. And you see political actors advancing, various ways of creating a narrative of past, present, and future that links that. So to take a step back, what does it mean to take the present seriously? Scholars of international relations, I argue, traditionally focus on the past to better develop an approach to the future. They are, what I call in other work, past-centric. So most objectivist, non-critically informed IR scholarship advances an imaginary of the past as a shared terrain, right? It's something to be explored and discovered. It's the place we go to assess and to evaluate our competing claims, right? We advance a claim, we look to history to see whether it's true or not. This notion of the past as terrain, I think, naturally emerges from the spatio-temporal representation of time imagined by Western models of linear scientific time and is reproduced by its continuing hegemony in social science, which is work that I very much agree with Andy on and his theory, his idea of timing theory, work that I've published before that I'm happy to talk about. I do think that this representation of the past may be more explicit for approaches that are self-professedly scientific, but I also think these characteristics are at play in critical and post-positivist approaches within IR. Even for those who are explicitly against notions of scientific inquiry, I think the understanding of the past as terrain still haunts their scholarship. So while I don't think there's a unanimous temporal imaginary that exists within international relations, I want to highlight three shared dynamics that I think are important. First is I think that the past is generally seen as something real, right? The events have transpired, they're real, there's something we have to contend with. Secondly is that the past is read as fixed, that when it moves from the left side of the timeline, moves from the right side of the timeline to the left, for those who read left to right, it becomes something that's fixed, it's unchanging, right? Like what's happened in the past is past, there's nothing that can change, whereas if you think about the future, there's a radical openness. Thirdly is that we tend to treat the past as knowable, right? If we don't know something about the past, it's not because the past is knowable in some unknowable in an ontological sense, it's unknowable because we don't know it yet, or we are lacking in some executional quality. It's not like the future, which is unknowable merely by its ontological status as the future. So centering our understanding of war and security on the past has advantages, I think, but by focusing on the past to discover regularities, I argue that the present drops out nearly entirely, that the present drops out nearly entirely from IR scholarship. And even if scholars themselves are deeply concerned by it, motivated by it, influenced by it, that the scholarship itself and analysis largely leaves it out, which is weird given that there's an emerging literature on temporality within our discipline, within security studies, and much of which points toward the importance of thinking about the present. This reticence, I think, is at least partly due to the disciplinary and epistemological commitments of the discipline. It always appears better to wait until the end of events to try and understand what's happened rather than try and think about them as they're happening. That's a theoretical insight that draws from epistemological commitments. Despite its being ubiquity, however, I think the present resists precise definition and generates countless perspectives. And so I draw from Mead on this. Mead says, a present then is contrasted with the abstraction of mere passage. It's not merely a piece cut out anywhere from the temporal dimensions of a uniformly passing reality, but is constituted by the emergent event. That is the occurrence of something that is more than the processes that have led up to it, and that by its change, continuance, or disappearance, adds to later passages a content that would not otherwise have possessed. So for me, then, the present moment is not simply the end of history, right? It is an emergent event that necessarily, by its existence as the present, diverges in some meaningful way from the past. Now, that meaning may be buried, it may be extraordinarily tiny, it can be extremely important, or it can be, completely unremarkable. But for me, that's an ontological quality of the present that I think should be retained in the way we think about war. So given this notion of present reality is continually emerging, becoming, but equally important, escaping prior to its capture in language, meaning, or physicality, change then becomes the ontological starting point for understanding apparent continuities. And for those of y'all who read Butler, in particular, her approach to understanding war and frames of war, as well as precarious life and force and nonviolence, this is very resonant of a sort of performative understanding of the way that war operates. So then, if we do take the present seriously, which I argue very much should, what's the payoff? If we think about the present, if we take it seriously in theorizing war, what exactly does it get us? I think centering the present is important because it allows us to explore its conceptual implications. By emphasizing heterotemporality and non-uniformity, by centering the present, as well as the emergent and novel characteristics that contribute to the present's indeterminacy and contingency, I think both constitute a way of foregrounding temporality in the study of war. Now, part of what I'm doing here, sort of at a meta level, is trying to make the argument. Many people, and Andy writes about this, have critiques of the way that time or timing is used in politics, of the way that we think about it. What I'm trying to develop here is an affirmative framework for thinking about time in a way that can enable constructive projects, constructive theories, constructive conceptions, knowing full well that they'll inevitably deconstruct, as all meaning does. More precisely, doing this focusing on the present means thinking carefully about which understandings are informing which collective imaginaries, because it's heterotemporal. It's not a universal, there isn't a universal past, present, or future. And this requires special attention to the ontological assumptions animating imaginaries and what allows these concepts to come into being. Berkawi and Brighton argue that war, then, is in the situation of being both taken for granted in its meaning and radically underdeveloped as an object of inquiry. And I think this makes sense within people who study and practice security, that, Lipschitz argues that war is the defining limit of security, and yet we have very little, it's very much a we know it when we see it type thing. And you can juxtapose that with conceptions and debates about terrorism as a form of political violence to make that more visible. Also, what this means, taking the present seriously, means adopting what Hutchings calls a heterotemporal orientation. What she means by that is a heterotemporal orientation questions the, quote, assumption of a fusion between his or her particular present and the present of world politics. This position requires painful political effort in cross-temporal engagement without the shortcuts enabled by taking for granted fusion of his or her particular present with the end of history. Now, what I think the insight is here is that the present, just as is the case with the past or the future, is a particular construct, it's bounded over, and it's never spatially or temporally universal. By emphasizing this temporal dimension, I think there are a number of advantages that come about, not least of which is a better appreciation of the globality and difference that exists within such a baseline conception at the heart of international security studies. So, for example, Balabar has a discussion of the gap between ideal types of war, wrestling with the early years of the war on terrorism. And he observes that wars are named, and they have to be. This is because behind the question of naming the war, there's an even more decisive question, which is the question of naming the war a war, i.e. granting it the character of a war. And only a small subset of political violence is temporally linked and collectively understood as war. Now, for that move to resonate sufficiently that people will fight and die, that resources will be massively redistributed, that large-scale commitments will take place, requires a very powerful discursive and thus a very powerful temporal context. And so part of the argument that I make both here and elsewhere is that the way we think about time, given that war is, quite literally wartime, is intrinsic to the way that we set apart certain forms of political violence as a war, as opposed to other ideas and all of the normative and substantive implications that follow from that. So even with constant discussion regarding its typology, war is often conceptually articulated as something beyond argument or debate, right? Scholars and practitioners typically debate technological trends, economic and humanitarian attributes, its characteristics, the changing character of war, as this is happening in Oxford. And so few would dispute World War I status as a war, for example, and thus in a manner of speaking, I argue that makes it timeless, right? It becomes the normal by which we understand war. But this raises the issue of what is it that constitutes the normal or privileged construct of violence against which crimes like terrorism, mass killing, or genocide can be made visible or intelligible. And so to understand these notions as divergent requires a backdrop. That backdrop, Barkawi argues, is one that is produced by Eurocentric thinking, right? It's this idea that real war is interstate war between nation states and that all other conflicts are therefore considered derivative. I think this operates much as whiteness does within racially neutral or colorblind ideas within American politics. I think that war similarly operates as an unspoken backdrop that is privileged within the way we think about IR and security. I think these concerns are not merely in the range of the esoteric, though. And one example I can think of is the contemporary US war on terrorism, right? After 2 decades and the positioning of US military forces in nearly 40% of countries around the globe, there's a number of other events that have taken place that are only quasi considered part of the counterterror war, right? The Iraq war in 2003 was positioned as somehow distinct from the operations in Afghanistan, separate still from the ongoing operations in northern Iraq and Syria. It's less obvious whether the drone strikes in Yemen, Pakistan, and Somalia are part of the same war that began in 2001 in Afghanistan by the United States. It's also unclear how to classify the strikes in Syria in 2017 and 2018 with respect to chemical weapons by the Trump administration. The Biden administration just conducted similar attacks last week, I believe. And the question this raises for me are these all separate conflicts with their own histories, or are they all part of one overall US war on terrorism effort? And so one could imagine a future project where these conflicts are recategorized, right? They're no longer seen, and this isn't just an analytical project, but actually in politics in the world, where these are categorized as one global imperial conflict, but this is not a series of separate conflicts. And they might be timed, to use Andy's term, by future scholars who employ a global perspective as such. And I think this reflects the importance that typologies that originate from, in the case of the US counterterror war, non-US political presence, I think could provide much better analytical purchase at a minimum, but more importantly, I think it would amplify the voices of those impacted by the violence, yet currently silenced by its dominant representations. Again, to go back to an observation that Butler makes in Frames of War. I also think, more provocatively, that a retiming of these efforts could also reject the periodization of the conflict as we currently understand it. In other words, retime when it starts, right? People will debate when the war on terror started, but it's typically 2001 or after, which is strange because Al-Qaeda had declared war on the United States in the mid-90s, as well as this is in response to a number of attacks that had taken place prior. And so I think this recategorization could potentially, reveal the war on terror as an outgrowth of US attempts at imperial dominance throughout the 20th century that were just newly justified by the events of September 2001. And in fact, this is already happening. The US government is already arguing that the war on terrorism started prior to 2001 for legal purposes to try the USS Cole bombers as military combatants, which requires an understanding that the US was in fact at war at that point. So centering the prisoner's experience, I think, also provides insights into warfighting, which is something I'm happy to talk about in Q&A, the difference between the way that political elites, decision makers, individuals who are actually fighting the war, the people who are subjected to the war, all come together in terms of collective memories. And when you stop to think about all of what goes into the US counterterror war, for example, the past, presents, and futures are mind-bogglingly diverse. right? The number of people affected, 40% of the globe, 2 decades worth. And, thinking about how these temporalities and presence interact with and interrupt each other, I think could provide important insights into the functionality of war, right? A recognition of, an act of humility of representing just what a dramatic, event the idea of war even of itself is. But what I think it also reveals is that it's what is remarkable is not just to the divergence in socio-political experience, but the coherence. Right, there are millions, if not billions, of people who are touched by the U.S. counterterror war. Their lives, their memories have been shaped by it. They all, many, there's a divergence of presence, past, and futures that exists there, and yet it still coheres. Why? And one question that I think is worth raising for all of us is why does it cohere? How does it cohere? How do those narratives exist? Because I think thinking about how that operates will give us a better understanding of just how it is that some of the worst acts of violence, some of the worst acts in human history can come to be normalized and understood as, completely unremarkable. So I think I'll stop there. I believe I'm out of time. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Andy, would you like to go next?
All right. Yes. Thanks, Chris, and thanks again, Callista, for having us. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about timeless theory. This is a question, or the question of timeless theory is, I think, a really interesting one in its own right. And it's important to say here that Chris has probably done the most of anybody in the field to explicate how theory strives for timeless qualities, or perhaps how timelessness helps establish the scientific bona fides of mainstream IR theory. But he's also deeply skeptical of the possibility of actual timeless theory. Just as he's critical of that aspiration for timelessness that he finds sort of running through the heart of security studies. So my remarks in many ways, I think, dovetail with this. And what I want to argue is that timelessness in IR never really did happen or exist. And it's mostly interesting in the way that the discourse of timelessness breaks down once we look directly at it. Put differently, IR's relationship with timelessness tells us a lot about how the study of international politics often works and how much the discipline of IR depends on unspoken temporal assumptions, even as IR theory struggles to ever achieve anything like a strict sense of timelessness. So to do this, I want to just summarize a few arguments about timelessness from my book, International Relations and the Problem of Time, which was published just down the road at Oxford University Press, and from a recent article in Millennium. And the way I've chosen to organize it is that I want to answer kind of two sub-questions about timelessness. Why do IR scholars use this term? That's the first question. And the second is, how does the term function in the wider discourse of IR theory? So first, why do IR scholars invoke timelessness so much? And they certainly do, right? If you sort of keyword search for it, it appears in more publications than not, even if it's kind of sporadic and fleeting. For many years, time functioned in IR, timelessness and time more generally functioned in IR as an intuitive backdrop for political processes, or a variable readily used to test for enduring causal factors, or perhaps a way of forwarding static, cyclical, and determinate accounts of geopolitics or great power politics, or other international political phenomena. This meant that although IR depended on time, it remained vulnerable to charges that it could not deal with time itself because its theories didn't really allow for historical variation, and instead treated the future as predictable and controllable. So these charges had substantive merit in many cases. There was a lot of static theorizing, or at least sort of overly conservative theorizing going on, and there remains a real sort of inclination towards prediction and the implied social control that comes with it. But these critiques also tended to get subsumed under a roomy and murky discourse of timelessness. IR scholars have used timelessness to signify a number of things, including but not limited to axiomatic logic, generalizability, social science in general, neopositivism, transhistorical continuity, the absence of historical context, cycles, or the quote-unquote regular beat of a recurring series, and the veneration of contemporary agendas through invoking long-dead thinkers. This latter one would be another example of what Chris talks about as presentism in IR theory. these references almost always make intuitive sense when you come across them, right? They make intuitive sense most of the time, but they tend to break down, again, upon closer scrutiny. Universal, generalizable, and transhistorical qualities, much like venerable traditions, all indicate that something holds in all or most eras or times. So far from being timeless, then, I want to argue that they're more accurately always timely or consistently timely, or what I would call timeful, right? They're not devoid of time. They work in every time. And their value rests in remaining pertinent to any situation. Diagnoses of continuity, cycles, rhythms, or lack of context all depend on some temporal passage against which the pattern or absence of variation manifests as such. If we didn't have some sense that time was passing, how could we assess that two processes were different, or that one process had endured over many months, years, or eras, or decades? So here we might recall, I think, a classical reductio ad absurdum argument. I got it from Richard Sorabji in Oxford Dawn, but I'm pretty sure he got it from some classical thinkers. But this is an argument against the use of timelessness, which is that if the time is truly the same, which would be to say that life is devoid of temporal passage, then there could be no recurrence, there could be no progress, there could be no comparison across eras. So basically all of our temporal language, including that of timelessness, would break down. Turned around, that's to say that invoking timelessness and having it make any kind of sense between myself and the audience requires a certain set of temporal assumptions, one of which is that the time is actually passing underneath it all. So as a further indication that IR is very rarely, if ever, strictly timeless, consider how references to timelessness produce strange formulations in the discipline. Here's a few quotes. IR talks about a timeless world in which concepts travel easily back and forth through the years. Or we hear about the timeless monotony of reproductive power relations. Or, quote, what is now is the same as what was, which in turn is the same as what will be. Again, these descriptions probably they sound familiar or they make intuitive sense, but they only appear timeless against that presumed background temporal passage, what we often think of and what we often criticize in other registers of theory as the uniform linear passage of time, which makes it possible to compare now and then, to apprehend monotony in reproduction, or to assess something traveling throughout the years. Yet another way of putting this is that timelessness mobilizes relative rather than absolute sameness for rhetorical effect in disciplinary debates. So it's actually it's a term that makes sense but intuitively, and in doing so helps us argue something that is perhaps difficult to unpack and get our point across quite quickly without, again, having to explicate it or defend it. Timelessness in IR almost never actually refers to the absence of all change, right? To a situation in which nothing passes, there is no dynamism, there are no processes, everything is completely fixed. And this is what timelessness would mean, at least according to more rigorous theories and philosophies of time. Okay, sub-question 2 then. So that's why IR scholars tend to invoke timelessness. The second question is, how does it function in the wider study of international politics? References to timelessness offer a trope, I think, for grasping a range of phenomena with different connotations for different people. While almost entirely unacknowledged, many of these invocations of timelessness signal some measure of insulation from what I call the problem of time, or time's supposedly natural tendency to pass and to bring change, dissolution, and death in its very passage. This is the idea that time passes naturally as a sort of force we can't control, and the effects that it brings are almost uniformly negative, right? Dissolution, disorder, decay, chaos, death. So I think when we hear scholars lauding or criticizing timeless claims in IR, I think we're already in a language game of sorts, where time is assumed to be an objective feature of existence, but one that also naturally confronts and usually sunders political stability and theoretical power. Another way of saying this is that claims are considered timeless to the extent that they are context invariant, but in a way that renders them free from the supposed deleterious effects of time's passage. This is perhaps the most common meaning of timelessness, but it only really works if we assume that timeless equates with being quote unquote, safe from the vagaries of time, right? Again, supposedly naturally its tendency to bring chaos and decay, and thus valid regardless of time. So I think what we actually see when we look directly at claims about timelessness in IR is not just rhetorical sort of umbrella terms for talking about context invariance or things that endure, but also some sense of actually overcoming the natural tendency of time to bring disorder, death, and decay. Discussions of timelessness in IR, and in most of the other humanities and social sciences, it must be said, indicate something then that is both outside of time, okay, or beyond time, and that it's free from the effects, or at least insulated from those negative effects, and in so being applicable in every time. So this is a really kind of, it's almost like a Mobius strip concept that it keeps folding back upon itself, and that's why I would prefer to talk about timeful theory rather than timeless theory in IR. I think it's conspicuous in this regard that there are no comprehensively frozen snapshot accounts of international politics, even though we hear a lot about timeless snapshot accounts of international politics. But that is exactly what a consistent and coherent use of timeless would entail, right? An account of international politics where nothing changes. Even the archetypal example of timeless neo-realism or structural realism is bound up with temporality and timefulness. Kenneth Waltz lamented, and these are all quotes, classical thinking as too static to grapple with the end of the Cold War and its implications in the present and in the future. He thought that structural theory was, sort of the key benefit of structural theory was expressly to peer into the future among the unknowns that abound there. And I think it would stretch the term past the breaking point then to describe these efforts, or even his kind of animating purpose and the theory he derived from it, as strictly matters of timelessness. Unless, again, what we really mean by timelessness is timefulness, applicability in every time, a theory that is insulated against change and contingency, and able to say then how the future will reliably comport with the present and the past. I hope it's at least clear from this that timelessness, this one mid-sized word, covers a lot of assumptions, ideas, and rhetorical and theoretical positions within IR. It does a lot of silent work, or we might say it hides in plain sight in these many theoretical and disciplinary debates. In the book, I connect these discussions to a wider but also hidden habit in IR of scholars trying to actively time global politics, time as a verb here, not as a noun. Trying to actively time global politics according to specific vocational and political commitments. That is, scholars hope to understand how politics work, but they want to do so in hopes of steering or directing or encouraging key processes in international politics to unfold toward preferred outcomes rather than other ones, right? Toward this end rather than that. And they do so by reference to an overarching organizing standard, what I would call a theoretical timing standard, or some sort of frame of reference, something that sets, again, the terms of the theoretical discussion. I mentioned earlier that IR depends on these hidden assumptions about time, and in the book I develop an argument that this stems from the fact that IR scholars have been timing social life all along. So the reason we have these kind of catch-all phrases that make intuitive sense, but again, if we look directly at them, they kind of start to fall apart and become more complicated, is that we've actually been using them to time global politics for years. And we've been passing on that knowledge kind of compressed and housed in these temporal terms, and we just never realized it before. IR strives to time political life, to actively help it unfold away from war, or away from death and disease, or privation, and towards peace or stability or progress or economic development. This requires theory to be timely. It requires us to develop timeful knowledge, or at least it would help if we could develop knowledge that applies across at least more than one context, but it almost never involves an actual engagement with strict timelessness as such. In this sense, then, the hidden language game of timelessness tells us much more about IR than it tells us about time itself. So if we want to get past that language game, if we want to really unpack and understand how ideas about time relate to the study of global politics, and even how time itself is sort of shot through with political power and political import, I think we need to resist this urge to invoke timelessness, no matter how powerful the term is in IR or other disciplines, and instead develop more rigorous and novel and perhaps even kind of internationally bespoke terms of debate for understanding international politics, both in time, but also as a series of timing struggles. And I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Andy. We'll now move into our question and answer segment. So if you have any questions for Andy or Chris, please leave them in the chat. So I've been emailed a question and I will read it out right now. So this question is directed to Dr. McIntosh. So earlier in your presentation, you spoke about the perceived fixity of the past and a retrospective attribution of meaning to modern conceptions of war. To what extent do you feel that this perceived fixity is due to the positivist leanings and epistemic claims of much American IR as a quasi-scientific discipline compared to the more normative focus of continental likes of the English or Frankfurt schools?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm tempted to answer that. Yeah, it is absolutely. That I wholeheartedly agree with the premise of the question. I think that I alluded to the epistemological commitments that deal with that cause this phenomenon to take place. But those epistemological commitments are a product of the way that American IR in particular tries to act as if they are scientists, right? To be, whether they are using history, whether they're using data, that they try to act in a way that's objective, that's neutral. It very much buys into a Newtonian understanding of the world and all that accompanies with it, in particular, Newtonian conceptions of time being apart from space. And so that's, part of, I think, where we get the timelessness the time fullness masquerading as timelessness that Andy is talking about. And anecdotally, I do think that there's a distinct that it is. I do think that it is better handled by post-positivists, relatively speaking, and there's less of the fixity of the past that exists. But I do think that a lot of post-positivists do have there's sort of a Marxian Foucauldian bent, particularly within sort of critical security, critical IR, one that I share and think is important. But because of that, there does tend to be sort of a reductive approach toward the past in the way that it's typically sort of universalized, and that has implications for the way that implications along the lines that the questioner is talking about.
Great, thank you, Chris. I have a question for Andy. So thank you so much for sharing about your book. It's titled International Relations and a Problem of Time. And I wonder if time has always been problematized in the literature and been characterized as a sort of problem to be overcome. And how would you recommend we grapple with this problem?
That's a really good question. So it has been consistently, or at least in the background, problematized. The interesting thing I think about IR, and although I'm not sure that it's unique in this respect, is that you also find, of course, a whole lot of references to time as something that isn't problematic, and that's clock time and calendar time. So something that kind of reliably, rhythmically, ceaselessly moves or passes. So I mean that puzzle or that disconnect. I guess probably a seeming contradiction is what animated me or kind of drove me in the first place to look closer at this, is that how could we, because you can find these references, sitting almost side by side, depending on where you look. Time as a decaying force that looks much more like there was an ancient time god called Time the Destroyer. You can see references to that in modern international relations. And of course, you can see it couched in the middle of a discourse, which is also perhaps using years to operationalize wars, right? Or talking about, again, the kind of forward march of progress from decade to decade. So, it was how could these things kind of coexisting so happily, and they're not bothering anyone in IR, even though they seem to be completely diametrically opposed. And I think my argument about the way to study that is to take a step back or take a step underneath perhaps and say, all these temporal references, whether they are consistent with themselves or even consistent with each other, refer back to underlying timing efforts. Right? These are these hidden efforts by scholars to get dynamic processes to again unfold toward preferred outcomes rather than either dangerous or catastrophic or just unpreferred outcomes. So this is something I borrowed and kind of developed from the social theory of Norbert Elias. It takes inspiration from, as Chris mentioned, Kim Hutchings' work on heterotemporality, that there's just a lot more sort of different times going on out there in social life than we realize. And I think that timing theory in that sense offers the most powerful way to make sense of those, especially those ones that do seem to kind of, point in opposite directions, by saying, well, they work and they don't trouble us because they help us time certain aspects of social life. And it might be that we're doing more than one of those at once. We're sort of in layered manifolds of timing efforts. And it's only once we start asking questions of that they become problematic.
Thank you so much, Andy. My next question will be directed to Chris while we wait for more questions from the audience. So earlier, Chris, you've mentioned that we should be taking the present more seriously in theorizing about war, about international relations and foreign policy. And I noticed that you've written an article in 2020 looking at the Trump administration and his foreign policy through a temporal lens. Would you mind talking us through a bit about your research and how this has implications on our understanding of Trump's foreign policy?
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, thank you so much for being one of two people to look at that article. I appreciate it. You're exactly right. Is that, I'm developing this idea of the present as a means of thinking, and I try to use that as a way of better understanding what's happening with the Trump administration, what was happening with the Trump administration, and part of the intuition behind it was that time seemed to be operating in a very different register for the Trump administration politically within the United States than within the United States, and those areas touched by the United States seem to be operating very differently. And so what I did was is attempted to look at the way the Trump administration was operating as the Trump administration was occurring, and develop some, identified some of the characteristics of the Trump administration, and that were, I mean, this is where it's tricky. It's not that the Trump administration was necessarily doing all of these things, but was benefiting from them, as well as, reproducing them. So it's complicated. But one element that, as I looked at those and to try and draw out some of the consequences of them. So one element that I saw within the Trump administration is just simply the acceleration of events. There was a conscious effort, and this was intentional on the part of the Trump administration, to increase the rapidity of events. And part of what that did, along with their willingness to engage in greater simultaneous actions, is it created a world in which the borders of the political present expanded, and it became sort of this sense of an indefinite present, which is beneficial for, a wannabe, somewhat successful autocrat, in that it makes the future difficult to imagine, and it makes the past difficult to use as a cudgel, right? So the hypocrisy is only a problem, is not a problem if you don't care about the past, right? It's your current actions are in violation of things you said you were going to do. And so when you can successfully create that dynamic, it basically gives you license to do almost anything, right? And so part of that was one element of it. The other element was, as I sort of inverted the concept of temporal othering, right? Temporal othering is typically the idea where, say with post-war Japan, post-war Germany, where they look at their past and say, this is a problem, we need to secure ourselves against it so that it never happens again because it's a threat. What was happening with the Trump administration was the opposite, right? The past was that which had to be secured and maintained, which had the paradoxical effect of making the present the threat, which is a brilliant move, not intentional, but is a brilliant dynamic for someone who is largely incompetent when it comes to running the sort of, elements of a government. Because if they screw up, that just proves the point, right? That proves that the present is threatening the past. Everything is threatening largely a white nationalist nostalgia. As well, it also shows if it works, well then, hey, it works. Look, so I'm bringing this into the future. And so those two things I thought largely, the payoff as far as foreign policy goes was led to, one was it created an enormous cover for corruption, right? Saudi arms sales, everything, much of what was done was personally motivated as opposed to institutional. And it also enabled acts of violence that were not previously unimaginable, but it provided free rein for the more aggressive elements of it. Luckily, you know, luckily, I mean, basically we dodged a bullet, right? Is that the United States has concentrated so much power in the executive that it was really up to the whims of Trump what American foreign policy was going to look like, and he just happened to be someone who was, kind of disinterested in, foreign conquest, and so thankfully it wasn't as bad as it could have been, but that doesn't mean it was by any means good. So.
Right, thank you so much, Chris. We have two questions from the audience, and I will go through them right now. So the first question asks, the past year has given us all very different experiences of time with the pandemic and lockdown. So what insights might timing or a focus on the present offer for thinking about our contemporary moment? So either we can choose to take this question.
I'll give Chris a chance to catch his breath, if that's all right. Yeah, thanks, Ty. I just saw on Twitter the other day, somebody said, happy March 366th to everyone, because it feels like we're still back in March 2020. I mean, it has, the past years, even before lockdown, I think completely changed our relationship to time, or the way that we sort of keep track of time or exert time discipline. Whether it's, faster days or weeks that drag on. And also a sense, again, that there's just, as Chris mentioned in his discussion about Trump, there's just so much happening, and so much of it seems to be so, for most of us, I think, unprecedentedly bad, or at least most of us in the US, in the UK, unprecedentedly bad that it's just impossible to keep up with. For me, that suggests, I think COVID and Trump especially suggests two things that timing theory can help us with. The first is, and Chris really, I think he gave a great kind of exposition of this about Trump's foreign policy and the way that he accelerates things, but also mobilizes specific accounts about the present and who is responsible for the present against both the past and the future. I think that's the critical edge of timing theory, because timing theory is arguing that we are always timing our lives, right? And again, on a number of different levels, whether it's just, I've got to get to the bus on time, back when we still took the bus to work or to school, or make the Zoom meeting on time. But I'm also thinking about the longue durée of, say, my career or an academic research project, or, in your case, your university studies. So we're always timing our own selves, but we're also often being timed by more powerful actors, right? They are actively constraining, shaping, and shoving, restricting or replacing the dynamics and the paces and rhythms that we might find most useful for our own purposes. And I think, so for me, that's what Trump was doing a lot of the time. Again, I think it was intentional, but not, or purposeful, but not intentional, in the same way that Chris discussed. I think he just kind of learned to do this over years and years of kind of trial and error, which he could afford to do because he grew up on a mountain of privilege. But by the time he got to the White House, he was really good at mobilizing different forces against each other, and again, kind of, dodging and weaving responsibility. And in the way that he accelerated the sheer amount of kind of awfulness that was visited on American and global citizens, I think he was actively timing our lives, and that we should always be a little bit skeptical when we realize we're being timed by somebody else, because it in the ideal sense that Elias talks about, it usually requires your consent, right? I mean, if we're going to have a new national calendar, we probably have a huge debate about it, and it has to kind of gain consent of the governed. But not all timing works like calendars. Some of it is much more freelance, and I think that's what was happening with Trump. The other one I'll spend a little less time on, but I think COVID disrupted our sense of time, and that's because, again, it undid or destabilized so many of the timing routines on which our daily lives are based. Again, going to work, getting out of the house, seeing other people, organizing your day by sort of certain segments and where you are at which point in time. And so in a sense, what COVID has shown us, and the way in which, that joke of happy March 366, what's that showing us is when a novel event kind of happens to a huge number of people, and all of these standard operating procedures or these habituated routines break down, we tend to, again, discuss it in the language of time because our timing efforts are coming apart. And so we then start to see time as problematic or as more mysterious, and we start talking about well, what is March? What is 2020? Did the past week last a year? And on and on. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I would largely echo what Andy says on this. I mean, one of the things I think it has done, like you're saying, is just it's exposed just how much our concept of time has so little to do with the time of the clock and the astrophysics, understanding of what a second is and whatnot. I think, I do think that this moment, the present, is generative, and I just wrote down some things that I think are useful from thinking about time with respect to the pandemic. One is, for me anyways, it's forced, not forced, but it's reinforced a commitment to the importance of thinking about difference with respect to everything, right? The way in which I experience the pandemic is very different. The way in which a particular student, a different student, people in other parts of the world, people elsewhere, and it requires sort of a radical humility in the sense of thinking that you're of recognizing the incompleteness of your perspective, and the need to reckon with how other people's pasts and futures are operating to constitute their present. The other thing I think it does is it forces sort of an orientation toward the interim, right? Is that there's a recognition that we're living in sort of an in-between time. Now, I think there's an argument to be made from an ethical perspective that we're always already living in an in-between time. And I think one of the things that it does is that it allows us to start thinking through what is necessary and what is not, and to recognize that much of what is perceived and timed as routine is in fact choice is too strong a word, but is in fact something that could be otherwise, right? We choose to orient our lives around these particular routines, right? Like embarrassingly, my world has changed so much that like the big sort of timing event of today is the Palace United game, right? Like that's what's I'm orienting myself around, besides obviously this. The third thing is that I think the pandemic also points to the radical possibility of the moment, the radical possibility of the present, right? The present is, and this is not news, and people who are much more, well informed from, religious studies to history to any number of things have can speak to this, but that there's much, so oftentimes we look at the future or the past as to guide our behavior, that we end up becoming sort of like lost in sort of the power of the present, right? Like if the present has this emergent quality, then things could be different and could be radically different. They may not, they may fail, they may be radically worse, but I do think that it's something there. So I'll stop there. I see other questions.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Andy and Chris. Our next question would be, what's the relationship between time and geography? Does it make sense to say that different regions or countries might be advancing or moving at different speeds or exist in different historic periods or times?
Chris, do you want that one first this time?
Yeah, I can take a stab at it. I guess the answer for me is yes and no. In that, I think there is a relationship between time and geography, and similar to, not to take the words out of Andy's mouth, but I think that there already is a relationship, one that is timeful, and just the very idea of advancing or moving at different speeds. So for me, a heterotemporal perspective does intersect with spatiality, and so there can be areas, collectives, imaginaries, regions that occupy different presents. But the power of thinking about the heterotemporal present for me is that it resists it denies the existence of any universal point of judgment, right? So to say that one is advancing or not advancing requires some sort of ability to adjudicate directionality and to identify where they are on a timeline. And I don't think that's I think that's inaccurate. This is I think this is a great point. It's a danger of thinking in heterotemporality because there already is heterotemporal thinking that, has been used in a way, largely to perpetuate, this, sort of the racialized understanding, the explicit racialized understanding of IR in sort of the first half of the century was all about this, right? Like who's further ahead, who's further behind. There's a great chapter about France and Algeria on this. And so, the short answer is, sorry, to come back, the answer is yes, I do think that they operate and have different timing regimes, can be operating in different times, but you can't, but heterotemporality means you can't sort of say one is here and one is there. Just you can articulate the relationships that exist.
Yeah, I would just go, I mean, just to add to that, I would say, I mean, I think there probably are different timing practices and different timing standards, and therefore different references or images of time that are geographically distinct. But at the point that we start talking about, different regions or countries or cultures advancing or moving at different speeds, we're coming dangerously close to the tradition of temporal othering that Chris mentioned earlier, which is to say, when we talk about moving at different speeds, I mean, we have some standard by which we're assessing speed, and usually when it comes to politics and kind of geography or human geography, that standard is economic development or democratic representation, or a lot of things that tend to prop up Western Europe or in North America as kind of the highest standards of civilization, right? So when you saw this during the Arab Spring, the Arab Spring was quickly, a collection of uprisings were quickly gathered under this one term, the Arab Spring. And of course, that means that the Arab world is emerging from winter and finally blooming. I mean, it all gets built into the metaphor. But, some scholars were quite explicit. Some security analysts were quite explicit. I mean, one of them said, freedom, a good idea whose time has finally come to the Middle East. I mean, it's pretty explicitly, some people are behind us, scare quotes around us, and thank goodness they're catching up. So I'm always a little bit skeptical about efforts to say that this geographical region or this people have a completely different relationship to time. They may have different words or different symbols of time, but I think it's always worth unpacking because I think they're probably still engaged in fairly similar general timing efforts, but they've chosen or learned to do it differently. And that's where the interesting part is. But if we start trying to say who's behind or ahead, now we're already into a kind of a political claim.
Great, thank you so much. I think I'll take the last question in the chat first because it's directed to Dr. Homm, and then we can have the last one about IR scholars for our last question for the day. So the question to Dr. Homm is, if following your theoretical setup, we think of timelessness as a perhaps now passive timing attempt of an international cosmography, how can we study its often overlapping relationship with, for instance, timing attempts of national biographies?
That's a big question, Mirko. I think we should, and I suspect it will be really interesting because there is, I've written a little bit on kind of an international cosmography, as you, I suspect, may be aware of. I think we've corresponded about this in the past. There's the international is just the space in between states, right? Or it's just the globe, and so it's hard to really point to the international in the same way that it used to be hard to point to a state until we said, the territorially distinct. And so we have constructed the international kind of as a universe, right, as the container for nation states and, the territory or the geographic features in between them or around them. But you're absolutely right that at the same time, all of these nation states or cultures have been busy constructing national biographies, right, a story of a common past and shared experiences of triumphs and defeats, and perhaps grievances or sort of vagaries to which they've been subjected and are trying to overcome, and each of those is distinct. And I think the interesting thing is how they might kind of, how, if we think about this, sorry for being kind of like a structural realist for the moment, but if we think of the international cosmography is up here and the national biographies is here, how do they kind of slot in and fit? And do they require efforts as states become more and more influential in the international arena? Do they require efforts to kind of square them or make them consistent with each other? Or in the case of perhaps the US, does, a national biography just kind of completely colonize huge parts of the international cosmography? So that's a long way of saying, yes, we should study it, but it's a huge project. So I think lots of us should study it.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Andy. And I'm very aware that we're now at the end of the hour, so I'll just keep the last question very quick. So our last question is, should IR scholars, in addition to crucial reflection on their own scholarly role in constituting time in IR, put forward an empirical research program studying how practitioners of international politics presently engage in timing efforts and how different temporalities may be in conflict with one another in practice, and how could such an empirical perspective take shape? Chris, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. I think, I mean, yes, I think the answer is yes. I do think that we should, engage in empirical research with respect to these, in addition to sort of reflexive analysis, and I think that's some of the most exciting stuff that we can do. And my answer will betray my own sort of training and interests, which is, I think this is something that can be done, through a lot of sort of, nominally speaking, qualitative methods, right? Through everything from discourse analysis to field work to going to ask people to any number of ways. And to be clear, this is already happening. I mean, I know of at least one article that looks at the it doesn't look at timing regime, it looks at temporality within post-conflict reconstruction. And I believe that was a piece that was done through field work. But I think both Andy and I are a little bit of similar mind, in that there's a whole host of applications for empirical research, right? Ontological, everything that Andy has described about the routinization of timing in the pandemic is ontological security type stuff, right? Debates, people who study the everyday practice of security and violence. This is something that's already there, right? How does your concept of the present work? Tim Stevens's book, which is I recommend everyone. I recommend everyone go read it, because once you do, you'll probably not want to read anything I have to say anymore. But his book is fantastic on the role of cybersecurity as far as that goes. And I'm blanking on some others, but I'll also leave those. So I think that an empirical perspective already exists in security. I think it's a matter of sort of expanding it and sort of growing it, for lack of a better metaphor.
I mean, just really quickly, since we're running over time, I mean, yes, we should, and perhaps more strongly, if we're not going to study the empirics of timing or construct a kind of an empirical, loosely put, research agenda around empirical timing in politics, we're going to have to ignore a lot of evidence, right? I mean, Donald Trump and Boris Johnson both referred to themselves as wartime leaders during the pandemic. The whole Brexit debate is shot through with time words. If you look at Hansard, they actually invent new time words like Brexiternity and neverendum and flextensions. And of course, when Brexit was a done deal, the next thing was that Big Ben needed to bong for Brexit. So it's we'd have to kind of actively look away from all of this timing talk, I think, that's going on in contemporary political life, and there's no reason we should. And I think we can connect that back to more historical research into the emergence of the times and timing regimes on which we rely, like standardized clock time and the Gregorian calendar and any other number of other things. So I think we should, but there's more to do than can be done by any one person. So I think a lot of us, again, should do it.
Great, thank you very much. So I think this concludes our session for today. So firstly, I would like to thank Andy and Chris very much for gracing our event today and for your insights. And also thank you to our audience as well for asking really great questions that certainly enrich our discussion. So I'm putting the links to our social media platforms in the chat again to stay tuned for our next event next week. And for anyone who is interested in rewatching the event, we'll be uploading this shortly on our YouTube channel, and we'll be posting an update on Facebook when that happens. So please keep your eyes peeled for that as well. So thank you very much again to Andy and Chris, and please have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Callista.
Thanks, y'all. Thank you.
Thank you.